The day Harlan Booker walked into Caldwell Morrow Financial Group, 3 people laughed. Not to his face. They were too polished for that, but he heard it. You always hear it. The kind of laugh that lives in the back of a throat, behind a closed conference room door, muffled just enough to pass for something else if anyone ever called it out. Harlan was 51 years old. He had gray at his temples and a slight stoop from 30 years of bending over drafting tables, ledger books, and balance sheets that didn't care who was holding the pencil. He came in that Monday morning wearing a brown suit, not old, not cheap, but brown, which was apparently its own crime at Caldwell Morrow, carrying a leather portfolio that had seen better decades, and he introduced himself to the receptionist with the kind of quiet that some people mistake for uncertainty. It wasn't uncertainty. Harlan Booker had never been uncertain about numbers in his life. What he was tired. 51 years old, and tired in a way that doesn't show up on any intake form. He'd spent 22 years at Meridian Capital down in Atlanta, built their municipal bond division from a folding table and a shared printer into something that managed close to $400 million in city and county infrastructure debt across southeastern states. He'd done it mostly without credit, which is a thing that happens, and then the company restructured, which is also a thing that happens. And at the end of it, Harlan Booker was handed a severance package and a plaque and a room full of people who shook his hand without looking him in the eye. That was 14 months ago. Caldwell Morrow was a wealth management firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. 43 employees, most of them younger than Harlan's career. The firm had landed a contract to manage a significant portion of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg School District's pension fund, $312 million. And they needed someone who knew municipal finance the way a surgeon knows anatomy. Not the theory of it, the bone of it. Their HR director, a woman named Petra Winslow, had found Harlan's resume through a recruiter and called him on a Thursday afternoon. She sounded excited on the phone. She used the word perfect twice. By the following Monday, he was standing in the lobby of their glass and marble building on South Tryon Street, and before he'd even made it to the elevator, he understood that Petra Winslow's excitement had not been contagious. The man who laughed first was Boyd Callister. Mid-30s, associate director of fixed income, hair that had been styled with something that cost more than Harlan's lunch. Boyd looked at Harlan the way certain men look at things they've already decided. A look that doesn't ask questions because it's already filed the paperwork. He didn't say anything that morning. He just looked, and then he turned back to the person he was talking to, and something moved in his shoulders that was not quite a shrug. The second one was Tess Garfield, a senior analyst who managed to make the word interesting carry an entire paragraph of condescension when Harlan was introduced to the team that afternoon. As in, oh, that's interesting. So you were at Meridian? With the faintest lift on were, past tense. Noted. The third was someone Harlan never learned the full name of. Just a young man in a pale blue shirt who passed in the hallway and said something under his breath to a colleague, and the colleague covered her smile with a coffee cup. Harlan Booker put his portfolio down at his desk, a desk near the window, which he suspected was given to him the way a good seat is given to a guest you don't expect to stay. And he opened his laptop, and he got to work. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg School District Pension Fund was a mess. Not a catastrophic mess, not the kind that makes the news, but the kind that a certain type of firm creates when they're more interested in looking competent than being it. The previous manager had chased yield in all the wrong places. Too heavy in long-duration corporates, not enough laddering on the municipal side, a duration mismatch that was going to hurt badly if rates moved even 60 basis points in the wrong direction. Which, at the time Harlan was looking at it, they were already starting to do. He spent his first week reading, just reading, not talking, not presenting, not scheduling meetings. He sat at his desk near the window and went through 3 years of portfolio reports, trade confirmations, investment policy statements, and actuarial summaries, and he took notes in a composition notebook. The same kind he'd been using since graduate school. In a handwriting that was so small and precise that his wife Claudine used to say it looked like he was writing instructions for insects. Boyd Callister walked by his desk on Wednesday afternoon and looked at the composition notebook the way you look at something from another era that you can't quite place, not hostile, exactly, just confused, the way people get confused by anything that doesn't have an app. "How are you settling in?" Boyd asked. "Fine," Harlan said. Boyd waited, apparently expecting more. When more didn't come, he nodded and walked away. What Harlan didn't say, what he had learned over 51 years to keep behind his teeth, was that he had already found 3 structural problems in the fund's allocation that were going to cost the school district money. Real money, teacher retirement money, the kind of money that was not abstract. He didn't say it that Wednesday because he wasn't ready. Harlan Booker did not present half-finished things. He never had. At Meridian, his colleagues used to joke that you could set a clock by his certainty, that he wouldn't open his mouth about a position until he'd looked at it from every angle it had and a few angles it didn't know about yet. Some people thought that was arrogance. It wasn't. It was just what it looked like when a man had been wrong enough times, early enough in his career, that he decided never to be wrong again. He needed one more week. The thing about being underestimated is that it has a texture. It's not just one thing someone says or doesn't say. It's the cumulative weight of a dozen small choices that other people make about you before you've opened your mouth. The meeting you're not copied on, the introduction that skips your title, the question directed past you to someone who has the right look for the room. By the end of his second week, Harlan Booker had not been invited to a single client-facing meeting. He found out about them the way you find out about things you're not supposed to know. The calendar updates that populate on the shared system before someone remembers to filter his access. The printouts left in the copy room. There were 4 meetings in 2 weeks, all involving the school district account, all attended by Boyd Callister and a rotating cast of junior analysts, none of whom had Harlan's background. Harlan noted this in his composition notebook. He also noted the afternoon that Greg Morrow, the younger of the 2 Morrows who ran the firm, grandson of the founder, stopped at his desk unannounced. Greg was 45, tennis fit, with the easy confidence of someone who had never had to prove a thing in a room full of people who'd already made up their minds. He pulled up a chair without asking, which Harlan recognized as the particular casualness of men who assume all chairs are available to them. "I wanted to check in," Greg Morrow said. "Make sure you're getting what you need." "I'm getting everything I need," Harlan said. "Great." A pause. "The team's been wondering, and I know you've been reviewing files, which is great, very thorough, but they're wondering when you might be ready to, weigh in." There it was. "I'll be ready next Monday," Harlan said. "I'd like the full investment committee, and I'd like a projector." Greg Morrow smiled the smile of someone who has learned to hide surprise. "Sure, Monday. We can do that." He left, and Harlan Booker turned back to his composition notebook and wrote 2 more lines. And then he sat for a moment, looking out the window at the skyline of Charlotte, at the early October light going amber over the buildings. And he thought about his father, who had worked 40 years at a textile mill in Gastonia and never once heard his own name said with respect inside those walls, and who had told his son the only thing worth knowing about patience: don't mistake it for acceptance. One is a weapon, the other is a wound. Monday came. Harlan walked into the conference room at 9 a.m. with his composition notebook and a single USB drive. He set up his presentation himself. It was 41 slides, built over 2 weeks of evenings at his kitchen table while Claudine read in the next room and occasionally brought him decaf without being asked, because after 30 years she knew when he was building towards something. The room filled slowly. Boyd Callister came in with Tess Garfield and 2 junior analysts, whose names Harlan had learned carefully and deliberately, as he always did. Jalen Ostrowski and Priya Mehta. Greg Morrow sat at the head of the table. The CFO, a quiet woman named Bertrites Hale, who had said almost nothing to Harlan in 2 weeks, but whose eyes moved across every room like she was reading a contract, took a seat near the door. Harlan stood at the front of the room. He didn't say good morning, and he didn't say so, and he didn't say He clicked to slide 1, which showed a single line graph, and he said, "The Charlotte-Mecklenburg School District Pension Fund is currently running a duration mismatch of approximately 4.2 years between its assets and liabilities. At the current rate trajectory, the fund will face a mark-to-market loss of between $14 and $18 million in the next 18 months if the allocation is not restructured. I'm going to show you exactly how that happens, and then I'm going to show you how to prevent it." The room was quiet in a different way than it had been when Harlan arrived 2 weeks ago. It was the kind of quiet that sits up straight. Slide 2. Slide 3. He moved through the presentation the way he moved through everything. with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who had done the work and knew it and didn't feel the need to perform urgency about any of it. He showed the duration gap. He showed the trade confirmation history and where the previous manager had been reaching for yield. He showed the rate movement over the past 6 months and what it had already cost the fund on an unrealized basis. Numbers, dates, sources, every claim sourced, every projection modeled 3 different ways. Somewhere around slide 12, Boyd Callister stopped leaning back in his chair. By slide 19, he was taking notes. Harlan noticed this and said nothing about it. He got to the restructuring proposal, a laddered municipal approach, conservative on duration, with a specific short-term reallocation to reduce the mismatch before rate pressure increased. He had modeled the cost of the trades. He had modeled the tax implications. He had called, on his own time, a contact at the North Carolina Local Government Commission to verify certain regulatory parameters, because that was the kind of thing Harlan Booker did before he put something in front of people. When he finished, the room was quiet for almost 4 seconds. "Questions," he said. "Not a request, just a signal." Tess Garfield asked the first one, a technical question about the benchmark duration assumption. A good question, actually, the kind you only ask if you've been following closely. Harlan answered it in 40 seconds and cited 2 sources. Boyd Callister asked about implementation timeline. Priya Mehta asked about cash flow impact during the latter build-out. Greg Morrow didn't ask anything. He sat at the head of the table with an expression that had shifted over the course of 41 slides, from polite skepticism to something that looked a great deal like recalibration. Beatrice Hale, the CFO, who had not moved or changed expression through the entire presentation, spoke last. She said, "How long have you known about the duration gap?" Harlan said, "Since the end of my first week." She looked at him for a moment. "And you waited. I wanted to be thorough." Beatrice Hale nodded slowly. She wrote something down. The meeting with the school district came 3 weeks later. Greg Morrow had pushed to have Boyd Callister lead it, which was the kind of move that Harlan recognized, the instinct to put a familiar face forward, to translate something through a more comfortable filter. He didn't fight it. That was the other thing his father had taught him. Pick what matters. What Harlan picked was the content. He wrote the talking points. He built the deck. He sat in the room during the meeting, 3 chairs from the head of the table, quiet as a stone, and when the school district's chief financial officer, a woman named Dr. Yvonne Prescott, 60 years old, silver locks, the kind of woman who had clearly sat through 1,000 presentations by people who thought polish was a substitute for preparation. When Dr. Prescott looked up from the slide showing the duration gap analysis and said who modeled this, Boyd Callister said Harlan's name. It was, Harlan reflected later, one of the more honest things Boyd had done since he arrived. Dr. Prescott turned and looked at Harlan directly. "You found this in 2 weeks?" "Yes, ma'am." "The previous firm managed this fund for 3 years." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable for everyone else in the room. Then she turned back to the slide and said, "Continue." What happened over the next hour was something Harlan had experienced before, though it never got less interesting to watch. The room reorganized itself. Not officially, not in any way anyone would have named, but the direction of attention shifted the way it always does when the person who actually knows the room becomes visible. Dr. Prescott's questions started going directly to Harlan. Her deputies followed her lead. By the time they reached the restructuring proposal, the presentation had become, in practice if not in seating, Harlan's. Boyd Callister, to his credit, led it. Afterward, in the elevator back to the lobby, Boyd said, you really knew your stuff in there." Harlan looked at him. "I know," he said. "Not with heat, not with edge. Just a fact stated clean." Boyd laughed, a real one this time, brief and surprised. "Fair enough." They filed the restructuring proposal with the school district in November. Dr. Yvonne Prescott signed off on it after a due diligence review that lasted 6 days, which Harlan understood to be fast, all things considered. The implementation began in the first week of December, a carefully sequenced series of trades that unwound the problematic duration exposure and rebuilt the portfolio along the ladder structure Harlan had designed. Harlan's title at Caldwell Morrow had been, since his hiring, Senior Fixed Income Consultant. It was technically accurate and practically vague, the kind of title you give someone when you're not quite sure yet what category they belong in. In January, Greg Morrow came to his desk. He pulled up a chair without asking, as he always did. But the ease in it was different now. Not the ease of someone who assumes, but the ease of someone who is recalibrated and is trying not to make a production of it. "We want to talk about your role going forward," Greg said. "All right," Harlan said. "The district is talking about a second contract, broader scope. They've referred us to 2 other county systems in the state. That's," Greg paused, "that's Harlan Booker doing that. That's your work." "It is," Harlan agreed. "We'd like to formalize things." He slid a paper across the desk, an offer summary for Director of Municipal Fixed Income, with a title, a seat on the investment committee, and a number that was, for the first time in 14 months, appropriate. "We probably should have had a better conversation about this from the start." Harlan looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up yet. He thought about that first Monday, the brown suit, the laugh behind the conference room door, the desk near the window given to him like a courtesy. He thought about 14 months of severance stretching thin, about Claudine teaching extra piano lessons on Saturdays without ever mentioning it directly, just being present in the way she always was, solid and undemonstrative, the way love looks when it's real. He thought about his father in the textile mill in Gastonia, 40 years of it. He picked up the paper. "I'll have an answer for you by Friday," he said. Greg Morrow nodded and stood and left, and Harlan Booker turned back to his window and the Charlotte skyline. And the January light was cold and clear, and somewhere in the building below him, in a server the size of a closet, sat a pension fund for Charlotte-Mecklenburg school district teachers. Teachers who had spent their careers in classrooms that nobody photographed, doing work that very few people tracked, building something that would matter long after anyone remembered their names. He knew how that felt. The Friday answer was yes. The Monday after that, Harlan moved his things from the desk near the window, which it turned out he had actually grown fond of, to the corner office that had been empty since a portfolio manager left in the spring. The office had its own window, a better one, facing north toward the university district, and Harlan set his composition notebook on the desk and his coffee cup on the windowsill and took a moment that nobody saw, looking out at the city, before he sat down and opened his laptop and got to work. There was a second county system to analyze. The initial documents had come in Thursday evening, 340 pages of investment reports and actuarial tables and policy statements. And Harlan had already read the first 120 during the weekend and found something in the duration assumptions on page 87 that he was going to need to think about carefully. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. Tess Garfield knocked on the open door at 9:15. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which was not a thing she had ever done before, and she set one on the corner of his desk and said, "Bertrice wants to know if you can do a check-in this afternoon." 3 o'clock. Tell her 3 works, Harlan said. Tess Garfield nodded and left, and Harlan Booker picked up his pen. And the morning was quiet and full of numbers, which was the only kind of morning he had ever truly wanted. The same building. The same skyline, the same man who walked in with a brown suit and a weathered portfolio, and the kind of quiet that other people, in their uncertainty, had mistaken for emptiness. It was never emptiness. It was the room he was already building, from the inside while everyone else was still looking at the door.